to this BESI Tech Cluster event. My name is Desiree Fields. I'm an associate professor in the geography department and also an affiliate of the BESI Tech Cluster. And it's my pleasure to introduce Cecilia Rikap, who joins us today from University College London, where she's an associate professor in economics and also the head of research at the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. She is also a tenured researcher of Argentina's National Research Council. Rikap's research is rooted in the international political economy of science and technology and the economics of innovation. She currently studies the rising concentration of intangible assets, leading to the emergence of intellectual monopolies from digital and pharmaceutical industries, as well as the distribution of intellectual and data rents, the resulting geopolitical tensions, and the effects of assetization on the knowledge commons. So all issues that are live in our current political economy. Today, Cecilia will be speaking on how big tech's real power lies in its control over global knowledge production, how these technology companies are developing state-like features and also infiltrating the state, I suppose, and what space remains for digital sovereignty. Please join me in welcoming Cecilia Rikap.
Hey everyone, so this mic should be working now. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and I'm very much looking forward to our discussion after my presentation. You can also feel free to interrupt while I'm presenting, because I'm going to try to go through a lot of issues that would, for me, explain the state of corporate power and its interplay with political power, as Desiree was introducing. And let me go straight into my presentation by framing the discussion within a broader theoretical framework, conceptual framework. So typically, I would guess that most of the people talking about big tech would directly jump into how big these companies are and how much they are, of course, in the case of big tech, concentrating data. We also know that they concentrate data centers, that they concentrate talent, but actually, I think that they are the most paradigmatic or most developed case of what I would describe as an intellectual monopoly that controls beyond ownership. So what is less studied is how leading corporations not only concentrate inside their own property, but also are capable of mobilizing resources beyond their ownership, let alone knowledge, but also, if you think of the cases of global value chains, franchising models, and so on, they are ultimately controlling portions of global capitalism. And I would argue as well that they are corporate planners that plan beyond ownership. And to explain the origin of this power to control beyond ownership, with many colleagues, we speak of this idea of intellectual monopolies, not as one-time innovators. I'm not saying an intellectual monopoly is a company that has one hit and then just profits or harvest the rest associated with it, but it's a more systematic behavior. And I find this quote from Peter Thiel very good in summarizing, actually, the behavior of an intellectual monopoly, where he clearly says that it's about being always in charge of this last breakthrough and always being ahead so that all the others cannot catch up. So typically in economics of innovation, either thinking in terms of this idea of creative distraction, the small companies, the startups that are one innovating after the other, or even in the framing that would accept that big companies become the innovators, either in one case or the other. For those that have heard these concepts, they are typically described as Schumpeter Mark I and Mark II, the early Schumpeter, the late Schumpeter. In both cases, there is a commonality, which is this idea that innovation takes place as a sort of discrete cycles. So we have innovation, then we have a moment of diffusion. In the case of what it will be described as Schumpeter Mark II, when the big company, think of the old IBM, the Bell Labs, and even General Electric and so on, innovation takes place and the process of diffusion will take more time, and this will enable the leading corporation to enjoy the associated intellectual rents for a longer period of time. But eventually, there will be a process of catching up. Some will be left behind, but there will be a process of catching up. There will be a process of, if it's not catching up, other companies, either smaller companies or a large one, depending on the pattern of innovation that you would be looking at, would be innovating anew, and the cycle will restart again. What I'm describing is a process where the same company is constantly moving the technological frontier within a field. It's constantly, and it can be one, it can be a few, But ultimately, these companies end up forming what can be described as a stable core that is surrounded by a turbulent periphery of actors that will also be contributing to the innovation process, but will not be the ones that are harvesting most of the associated profits. So when we speak of intellectual monopolies as companies that are constantly innovating, that doesn't mean that they are themselves the actors that are producing the innovation. But actually, we speak of how this has been, in particular, in the last couple of decades, co-produced with thousands of other organizations. And this is why the key feature to think of intellectual monopolies is the systematic capacity to capture knowledge, capture different forms of intangibles, also narratives, and transform them into their intangible assets, even in cases when they were not even participating in the production of knowledge. And all this results in what can be described as permanent and proactive rentiers, because these are companies that profit in part through sustained intellectual rents, but it's not that, again, they just sit and wait to harvest the rent, but they are constantly reinvesting in R&D, reinvesting in what I would describe as the means of information and knowledge appropriation, which in some cases will also be tangible assets that enable them to continue appropriating more knowledge and more data. Think, for instance, of the data centers as an example. And although there is a typical way in which these companies, maybe here, yeah, in which we can, in which we can think of these companies as those that are concentrating a lot of intellectual property rights. And of course, part of the story is a story of the expansion and of the US intellectual property rights regime to the world, an intellectual property rights regime that has become more stringent and enables to patent a way larger variety of things. This is not only a story of intellectual property rights and companies concentrating intellectual property rights. In fact, the speed of the innovation itself can act as a mechanism of appropriation. And of course, companies also use secrecy combined with the speed of the innovation and differential absorptive capacities, that I will explain the term just in case in 1 second, to perpetuate themselves as the intellectual leaders or intellectual monopolies. The idea of absorptive capacities, for those of you that haven't heard of it, basically refers to how we make sense of knowledge. To make sense of new knowledge, we need to have existing knowledge. Knowledge is probably the only product that is produced also with itself, with knowledge. So knowledge is at the same time input, process, and output, which means that those that are at the knowledge frontier will be better prepared to make sense of the new knowledge that is co-developed or directly developed by others and use it for its own benefits or purposes. And this is why we can think that when a company innovates and it's at the knowledge frontier, it will not be in equal terms with all the others. It will actually, if it decides to continue developing science and technology and other forms of knowledge, and if it's capable also of capturing what I would describe as a corporate innovation system with multiple actors co-producing knowledge that ultimately serves its own purposes, that company will be able to constantly renew its advantage. And on that basis, it may not even need intellectual property rights. This doesn't mean that they don't matter at all. It means that they don't tell us the whole picture. And this is why I'm showing you there the list of the, I think it's top 20 or top 30 organizations in terms of the number of AI granted patents in 2022 to emphasize that either this data is wrong or clearly this data is not telling us the whole story, because the number one company is not a big tech company, but Toyota. And it's not only that we need to go, I think, is it that I need to click here to get the next one? Or is it, yeah, okay, perfect. And it's not just that intellectual property rights don't tell us the whole story, but also that in the case of today's intellectual monopolies, as I was already anticipating, a key concept is this idea of controlling beyond ownership. So if we think of the past, again, a comparison with old intellectual monopolies like the old IBM or AT&T, these companies were mostly producing the intangibles in-house. And when they were connecting to universities or other organizations, they were doing it with universities primarily to hire talent, to directly use the knowledge that the universities were developing, but they were not co-creating, co-developing the knowledge with the universities. This is a much more recent process of the last decades where it has become so frequent that many leading corporations even have part of their research done inside the same university buildings. And this is not only a process that takes place in the production of knowledge, but also, of course, in the co-production of, and it has actually started, in the outsourcing of part of the production processes and the formation of global value chains. So if you think of it, we can summarize it as a sort of two phases. A first phase when we witness the formation of global value chains, and a second phase that becomes more complex, where it's not simply the typical global value chain would be described as the leading corporation outsources the tangible part of the production process and keeps in-house the intangible part, the design, the marketing, the R&D. The second phase is more complex because the leading corporation also outsources part of the pieces, the segments of the production of innovation, of the production of marketing, design. Part of the intangible production is also being outsourced. And also because the leading corporation sometimes keeps in-house part of the tangible dimension of the production process. And if we want to even make it more complex, in some cases due to geopolitical reasons, but also due to the specificity of the industry, we will see cases where the leading corporation also becomes a vertically integrated company, as in the case of BYD, for instance, where the criticality of the raw materials and the geopolitics are essential for understanding a process that at first sight would have seemed completely counterintuitive to the more general dynamics that one could witness when we think of how leading corporations organize production globally. And in these two phases, for me, one of the concepts that I've been looking at the most is this idea of a corporate innovation system. That is a concept that aims to describe how innovation is co-produced by many, but then the profits are associated with the new knowledge, the new technology, are disproportionately appropriated by the intellectual monopoly, and where it is also the intellectual monopoly, the one that steers, that sets the direction, that defines the priorities that will be researched within the corporate innovation system. So it's not only a way to conduct a process of what I would describe as knowledge extractivism or knowledge appropriation, but it's also essential for setting the direction of the process of knowledge production. And of course, within the corporate innovation system, it matters to make a distinction between appropriation and assetization, between appropriation and the capacity to afterwards capture value on the basis of the appropriated knowledge. And sometimes, as in the case of big tech, and I can discuss this later on in the Q&A if you want, in some cases they also capture value on the basis of knowledge that hasn't been appropriated. For instance, when they contribute to open source. When they contribute to open source, there is this, basically they put pieces of the software in open source, and this results in a strengthening of their intellectual monopoly. These pieces of open source software usually become de facto standards in the industry and enable the companies to keep on reinforcing their position at the core. So when we think directly, when we move, and these dynamics that I was describing, again, are not exclusive of the tech sector. If you think of big pharma companies, if you think of other leading corporations like Siemens, for instance, or Toyota, that I was mentioning it before, automobile industry leaders, if you also think of companies that come from completely different industries, like mass consumption multinational corporations, Unilever, Nestlé, Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, all these companies base their advantage in the systematic transformation of intangibles into their assets, intangibles that are not only, again, produced by them, but they still are able of capturing. So when we go and focus on the case of tech, and in particular, I will speak here of Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, you can already see that between 2014 and 2019, these companies were fully dedicated to the research on artificial intelligence. That table over there basically summarizes a text mining analysis of the content of their scientific publications between 2014 and 2019, so way before the AI hype. And you can see the terms, and they are all related to AI, to machine learning, and of course connected to data. But one could just look at this and think, okay, this is explained because these companies, as I was saying at the beginning of my presentation, they are constantly capturing, they have drained universities and are constantly capturing talent. And this talent then writes papers about the research that they are doing that then will be used, of course, for products and so on. And indeed, these companies do have huge R&D laboratories dedicated to AI, and there you have some examples. But what I want to emphasize today is about how they control beyond ownership, as I was anticipating. So not so much about how they organize research inside the company, but how the companies are capable of setting up global networks with thousands of other organizations and capture and steer the knowledge that these other organizations are developing. And part of that process is also done through narratives and regulation. And I'm just going to say a word about this before moving into the science networks, because these are also part of the networks that matter and where I'm looking at the moment. You probably heard at least one policymaker or many, if you follow the news, saying that regulation shouldn't stifle innovation. This is one of Starmer's, the UK Prime Minister mantra, because he's completely obsessed with the idea of economic growth. And of course, he has even went to the CMA, our a Federal Trade Commission, and said, all good what you are doing, but remember, our priority is economic growth, and regulation shouldn't stifle innovation. This is, of course, a crafted narrative. And I don't need to delve deeper into that, I think, but I can, again, do it more in the Q&A. But what I want to emphasize is that big tech companies themselves have been promoting this type of narrative. They have also been promoting, through their social sciences and humanities research, ideas on how to think about AI, what's the focus that regulators should have when it comes to AI. For instance, the focus on regulating AI uses has been a way to divert the conversation away from who is producing AI. But they also control the whole knowledge and innovation network in AI. And to show you why I say this, or how can I provide evidence of this, let me explain you this huge network. This network is plotting the top 150 organizations in terms of their presentations at the largest AI conferences in the world between 2018 and 2020. I did the same analysis for previous periods, and one can see clearly how in 2014, 2016, and up to this map, big tech companies, in particular Alphabet, so Google and Microsoft, went from being at the margin of the network to position themselves at the core, at the center of the network. This means that they are capable of influencing the research not only of their direct co-authors, this is a network of co-authorships, but also, of course, the research priorities of the co-authors of their co-authors and the co-authors of the co-authors of their co-authors, and so on and so forth. And also, because this is the frontier of AI research, these are the most important AI conferences, this will have an impact on the whole field, because everyone within computer science and other related fields developing and thinking about AI will be looking at what is being presented at these conferences in order to decide their own research priorities. So basically, this means that the research agenda that we have in artificial intelligence is the research agenda of Alphabet and Microsoft. And there is something that is even more interesting, or as interesting, which is that the clusters over here, the red ones, are mostly populated by Chinese organizations. So not only Chinese universities, but also Chinese big tech. And Microsoft, which is red, which means that from all the actors is closer to Chinese organizations, which is why it belongs to one of the red clusters. Microsoft is the bridge between the research on AI in China and the rest of the world. So the geopolitical positioning of Microsoft is of utmost importance. Alphabet is also the second most central node in the network. And what is also interesting is that these companies, indeed, they present a lot of papers in these conferences, and part of their centrality is explained by that. But the Chinese Academy of Science, which is in the more or less middle of one of the red clusters, has actually presented more papers in this period. But of course, it has fewer co-authors, and its co-authors are mostly inside China, which means that even if it presents more research, its capacity to directly influence the research agenda is lower. One could still say, okay, cool, I mean, I understand they are at the center, but they are still presenting the work at conferences, which means that they are sharing what they are doing. But of course, they are not sharing the code, they're not sharing the data, they're not sharing the model. They are simply presenting, saying, we did this, this, and that, and these are the results. And in fact, if we look at the share of co-authorships, so the number of papers that any of these companies publish with at least one person that is working for another organization over the total number of publications, and compare this to the co-ownership of patents, we can get an indicator of knowledge appropriation. For Microsoft, for instance, but in other published research, I've been looking at all the other big tech, Chinese big tech, big pharma companies, Siemens, other Chinese organizations, leading corporations that behave as intellectual monopolies, basically co-author research with hundreds, thousands of other organizations, and then don't share the ownership of the patents. Of course, not every scientific publication will translate into a patent, and the content may differ to some extent. I've also done some content analysis comparing the main topics in the scientific publications and in the patents, and of course, they are within, as expected, they are within the same fields and questions. But even if there is no direct match, and some of the papers don't have a patent associated with it, and some patents don't have any paper associated with it, the discrepancy is so big. See here for Microsoft, between 2012 and 2021, almost 9 out of 10 papers had at least one co-author that was not working at Microsoft, whereas only 1% of the patents had a co-owner that was not Microsoft. So this discrepancy clearly speaks of a systematic predatory practice. So it's not just that someone worked for Microsoft and then left and worked somewhere else, or any other specific situation that you can think of. This is still just about research. And although I don't know how familiar you are with AI research, actually AI research is not so detached. It's not that they are just thinking about the mathematics of the models. Mostly what they are presenting there are the results of the models themselves. So it's not that we cannot speak of a sort of like linear model of innovation where in the scientific conferences what we will have is basic research or anything like that. But even so, one could still argue, okay, they control the research network, but what about all the startups? These big tech are big and we know it, but there are also thousands of startups. But then when we look at the startups, we see a similar picture. And here what I will be showing you is venture capital investors. By February 2024, the top 10 venture capital investors in AI startups included Google and Microsoft. So, of course, there will be others like Sequoia Capital, Y Combinator. These are companies whose business is to be a venture capitalist. But on top of that, we have big tech companies. This is a strategy that is not exclusive of big tech companies in their relation to AI startups. Probably you've heard the history of OpenAI and Microsoft, and you're familiar with this dynamic. The first thing that this table shows us is that the relationship between OpenAI and Microsoft, although it has some specific features, and I will come back to this later on, at the same time is not an exception. It's part of the way in which the industry develops, and it's part of the way in which big tech companies organize this turbulent periphery of actors that behave as their satellites in the co-production of knowledge and also in the co-development of products. But it's not exclusive, as I was saying, of AI, because if one goes then and does the same type of analysis for startups in general, we can see that some big tech companies in particular are very actively investing in startup companies. And systematically, I've been doing this also for other periods. All this is for February 2024, but if you continue doing it, one can still see the same type of dynamics. Companies like Apple do not engage in this type of behavior, whereas Google, Microsoft, Amazon are particularly active. Why are they doing it? What is it that they get from it? And one can just reply, potentially money. I mean, it's a financial investment, and when they end up funding a startup that is successful, they will make money. Yes, but I would argue that this is not the main reason why they do it, and why they do it at such an extended way that ends up being a way to control the whole network of startups. And for me, there are two main reasons why they do it. They are interconnected. One is to get access, privileged access to the technologies that the startups are developing, and therefore reinforce their intellectual monopolies, since they are the only ones that get access to everything that the startups are developing, and can centralize and can decide what of all that knowledge is more relevant for their perpetuation of their intellectual monopolies. And at the same time, it's a way to steer the development of the technology that the startups are doing, and also to make them prioritize certain things over others. So it's not only that they can steer the whole technology by deciding which startups they are giving money to, but also that when they give the money, they will also influence what the companies are developing. And they do so also in a way that locks them into the cloud. But before getting into that, let me zoom out a bit from the reality of the startups to what has been on the news lately. Because what I've been describing about the investment in venture capital money to startups is part of a broader dynamic that I would describe in a nutshell as big tech companies reinforcing their semi-core. So if you are already with me in this structure of core and periphery, so the core, the intellectual monopoly, the periphery, the other actors that are co-producing knowledge, value that ends up being disproportionately captured by those at the core. Now we can make it a bit more complex. Actually, the ideas of core and periphery that originated in the analysis of global capitalism also included in the world systems analysis a semi-periphery. So a ring that was in between the core and the periphery. And we can actually be even more creative and think that there are different layers or different degrees of peripherality, if that term exists. Of course, when Microsoft invests in OpenAI, it's not given the same money as when Microsoft invests in a startup XYZ. In the two cases, the purpose might be the same, but there is a difference, and there's a difference in the importance that OpenAI and all the other startups, to give you to just present it in a very stylized way, have for Microsoft. Because OpenAI is part of their, if you want, semi-core or semi-periphery. And the same happens with other companies, like Intel, for instance, a historical leader, a historical intellectual monopoly that has nonetheless been losing its advantage and has been actually trying to develop its own GPUs, but failing again and again and again. And because it still has its CPU business, and NVIDIA needs it, NVIDIA decides that it's taking equity and committing to a long-term partnership with Intel in order to reinforce its own value chain, in order to reinforce its own sphere of control. So typically, and one thing that I've been doing throughout all my research, I would say, is mostly looking at how the value and the knowledge is produced in the whole system, and then there are flows that lead to a concentration of all that at the level of the core. But then the core, in order to perpetuate the whole system, in order to perpetuate its sphere of control, also needs to invest, in particular, in certain layers that are the closest ones to the core, to make sure that those organizations keep on doing business. And this is part of what we are seeing now. This is part of what we are seeing now in different forms. I don't know if you've heard, for instance, that Microsoft has a deal with this company, Nscale. When a few years ago, a colleague whose research I like, but not particularly this paper, published a paper, Kinbirch, that was saying basically, the conclusion was intangibles don't matter. Look at the balance sheet of big tech companies, how heavy they are investing in capital expenditure. There are so many things to say to that, starting by the fact that intangibles are incorrectly measured on the balance sheets, that the type of investment in capital expenditure of big tech companies is tightly connected to their concentration of data and intangibles, because it's not that they are investing in a whole manufacturing line, they're just investing in data centers all the time and undersea cables. But also there is something else, which is that we measure capital expenditure, two different things. When Amazon Web Services purchases a data center, is capital expenditure. And when Amazon Web Services rents a data center, is also capital expenditure. And this is financially not the same. In terms of economic risk, it's not the same. Because if your business goes wrong and it's not as profitable as you expected, the demand is not as high as you expected, it's easier to terminate a contract where you were renting a data center than selling your data center as a whole if it was your own. So there is also this additional thing to say that is connected to the business or to the investment of Microsoft in this UK company Nscale, which basically is part of the companies that form the value chain that installs the data centers. And then there is another type of agreement that is one of the focuses of my forthcoming book, which is the agreement among leading corporations from different industries. So not only looking at what happens with the strategic partnership agreement between, let's say, NVIDIA and Google or Amazon, Microsoft, which of course enables them to co-develop technology and make their technologies become more co-specialized and therefore reinforce their core within the tech sector. But what happens that if you start searching for strategic agreements and looking for search for whatever leading corporation from whatever industry you want, and then search that name and either Amazon or Microsoft or Google, and you will find at least that one of them has a strategic partnership agreement with it. This is just an example. LVMH, the leading French company from the fashion and other luxury goods industry, that has a strategic agreement with Google that includes the development of technology. So it's not simply LVMH adopting Google's technology. And that for Google was particularly relevant. Google invested in this agreement. It's not, Google is in a way losing money in this agreement. And it is because LVMH, as I found out through interviews, LVMH represented everything that Google searches for when it identifies a strategic partner. It was not only enabling Google to sell more than one type of its products, and in particular to sell Google Cloud, which is a priority, but it was also an agreement for co-innovation. It was also an agreement that would increase Google's reputation because LVMH could be seen as what Google describes as a lighthouse. So it's a way to signal not only to others in the industry like L'Oreal, but also to other companies. In the interview with someone from LVMH, the person mentioned the example of Total, so the energy company, an industry that has nothing to do with LVMH. But the example was the person was basically saying, for companies like Total, the fact that LVMH has chosen Google will be a sign of Google being the right choice for the cloud and for digital technologies and AI more broadly. So ultimately, all this, there are two common denominators. One, it reinforces the core, and therefore strengthens the segmentation and the inequalities at the industrial level that then, of course, are impacting at the level of working conditions. But also, another common denominator is the locking effect, because all this ends up happening sooner or later inside Google, Amazon, or Microsoft Cloud. And the cloud, which is a very concentrated market, 65% of the global market is in the hands of these three companies, is actually much more than infrastructure as a service. And AI has become a sort of Trojan horse. Why AI has become a Trojan horse? Well, because everybody speaks of AI as the technology, as what needs to be regulated, as the frontier. And either way, even if the AI promises deliver or not, because AI is being produced, exchanged, and consumed in the cloud, by the time we see whether the promises are delivering or not, everyone will already be inside the cloud, had already migrated to the cloud, and will be completely locked in the cloud of Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. And this is because, again, the cloud is not only a space where we store our data or where we can run an algorithm. It's not only infrastructure as a service. It's a supermarket of digital technologies. It's like the Target or the Amazon.com of digital technologies. where whatever you want to buy in terms of digital technologies and even related consultancies and many more can be purchased as a service, can be rented as a service on the cloud, where, of course, not only these companies themselves offer the services, but thousands of other companies can offer services and become what the companies describe as their partners. There you have an example of the number of services that were on offer at Amazon Web Services by April 2025. These are tens of thousands of services that end up being used in an interconnected way. So if you're a startup and you're developing your solution, you will be basically coding inside the cloud. You will be calling services, using and paying for these services every time you use them, and then you continue coding, which makes it a unique way of producing, where everything is completely interconnected and entangled in a way that it becomes impossible to leave. And I said before that the cloud is a marketplace, but actually the cloud is more than a marketplace. And to explain why I say that the cloud is digital technologies, space of production, exchange, and consumption, let me give you the example of a cake. So let's say I want to bake a cake. I go and buy from different suppliers all the ingredients, and then I have a small industrial kitchen. I bake the cake, and then I sell it on whatever bakery that it's here outside the campus. If someone decides that they want to buy the cake, then this person will buy and eat the cake, let's say with their family at home. And we have three clearly separated spheres: the sphere of production, the sphere of exchange, and the sphere of consumption. And each sphere has its rules, its norms. In the house, for instance, if it's a patriarchal home, the father will decide how many slices everyone consumes, for instance. What happens in the cloud is that everything is inside the same space, and it doesn't happen as a sort of linear process that we can clearly analytically detach, but everything is interconnected because of the way in which I was explaining before that the services are developed, which means that once you're inside the cloud and start consuming the services, it becomes impossible, unless you want to start all over again, to leave the cloud, regardless of the exit fees. So it's a huge sunk cost that goes beyond what it's paid upfront in the case you want to leave. And the companies themselves produce the cloud in this way. I even interviewed someone that was whose job was to create a stickiness, to create a sort of a strategic lock-in to, as the person was saying, it is not, so to the point that it is not in your capacity to, it is not in your control to switch to other companies easily. And this is not only affecting companies, certainly not only affecting startups or leading corporations, as I was interviewing for my book, as I was mentioning before, but also governments. And the UK government, for instance, has signed a 5-year agreement with Microsoft, where basically everything that the UK government does in terms of digital transformation and so on happens inside Microsoft Azure. So why is it so important? Because, of course, every companies, organizations have never produced everything in-house. I mean, the division of labor is something that comes from before the emergence of the modern form of the corporation. So why is it so problematic that these technologies are being outsourced to the cloud? And why is it so problematic that organizations of every size and every form and every type are becoming subordinated or locked in to Amazon, Microsoft, or Google Cloud? And I think that this is because of the type of technology that they are becoming dependent on. Because governing, no matter what you want to govern, even if you want to govern your own existence, requires information. If you want to govern citizens or the workers, if you want to govern organizations and networks, if you want to control your global value chain, your franchisees, if you want to establish a platform, companies like Uber, Netflix, they all depend on the cloud to exist. And probably now everybody knows this since since lately there have been a lot of blackouts. And then people realize, all this depending on AWS or Microsoft. And yes, and these companies and also the governments end up depending on on Amazon, Microsoft, and Google Cloud, because there they get the control technologies that enable them to control those that are further below. to extract value and reinforce their intellectual monopolies. Think of drug development, think of marketing and all the advertising industry. Everything is underpinned by digital technologies. And with generative AI, there is even a larger push to transform every discipline and make AI a method of invention, which means that ultimately, because again, AI, in particular Gen AI, even DeepSeek models are being sold on Amazon, Microsoft, and Google Cloud, everyone will be pushed to migrate to the cloud. And at the same time, these tools are already being used by leading corporations from other industries and governments in the same way that Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and other tech companies were already using artificial intelligence and so on inside their platforms. So it's an extension of those logics of control, of customized control, to other spheres of capitalism. But in the end, the companies that are the rulers, the ultimate rulers, are those that control what type of digital technologies are being developed and who gets access to this. So in a way, this is becoming a sort of further differentiation of the organizations at the core. And the US government, not only by revoking Biden's AI executive order, which was anyway just regulating AI uses, has favored these companies, but it has also favored them with something that is called the America's AI Action Plan, that basically says that more AI is more cloud, and in particular that the Department of Defense, now Department of War, needs to be at the forefront in the adoption of AI and cloud, and one can already see the increase in the value of the contracts that big tech companies, in particular Amazon and Microsoft, but also more recently Google as well, have with these companies. It's the case of Google is particularly interesting because you may remember the case of Project Maven and how Google employees were the ones that denounced that Google had a contract with the Pentagon, and Google was obliged to cancel that contract, or at least this is the official story or what we know. And inside Google principles, they were saying in this idea of we don't do evil and so on, they were clearly saying, okay, we are not contributing to warfare, we're not contributing to defense tech, but they changed that. They changed these principles less than a year ago. So now they are celebrating the contract with the US Department of War for $200 million that was announced a few months ago. Of course, other companies like Palantir, or there are two Palantirs here, I know, I'm sorry, and Anduril do have contracts of a similar amount of money with the US Department of War, but there is a crucial difference here. A company like Palantir is a company that depends on these contracts to exist. A company like Microsoft is a company that makes money from every single industry on earth and doesn't depend on the contracts with the US Department of Defense to make money. It does depend on the US Department of Defense to have an ally inside the US administration, regardless of who is the president. And this is the role of the US Department of Defense during Biden's administration, where the US Federal Trade Commission tried to regulate the companies, and the US Department of Defense was saying, we need AI, China is the real threat, and the only way to continue contributing to a democratic world and having the US as the superpower is to use the AI technology that is provided by big tech. But anyway, this is even making the US Department of Defense liable. And there is another thing here to highlight, that in this story of the development of technologies, we can actually think of a process where in the past, it was the US Department of Defense that was setting the direction, orienting the development of the big technological changes through DARPA, whereas now are these companies the ones that are defining what AI we have and who gets access to it and what. But this is that the AI Action Plan has something else. It's not simply that the US is going to be all about AI and the cloud, but it's also that the US government will be pushing all the other governments that are considered allied governments in the world to adopt US technology. And this is not new. I mean, this has been, I'm Argentinian. This is the story of peripheral regions in the world. But before it was hidden, it was not so straightforward, whereas now it's directly in the letter of the AI Action Plan. Just to let me very briefly go back to corporations and why they are accepting to become dependent on these companies before giving you a sort of summary of my presentation. And here I just wanted to give you a sense of what I found in my fieldwork. I was already mentioning that for my forthcoming book, I did interviews. I interviewed 112 AI scientists, AI engineers, and then people using and co-developing AI, not only in big tech companies, but also in a total of 55 multinational corporations. And the idea was precisely to identify in a more granular detail the ways in which these other leading corporations were becoming dependent on Amazon, Microsoft, and Google clouds. And why also, not only that they were becoming dependent, but also what you have here is a bit of the why. Why are they accepting this dependency? And this can be summarized in what I was saying before about control and controlling those that are further below. So controlling workers, controlling their global value chains, controlling consumers, and also reinforcing their intellectual monopolies. And this can be seen in, for instance, this, in particular, for instance, in this one, and let me show, in this one as well, from the quotes, where they speak about drug development, or, for instance, for the case of L'Oreal, more data and less luxury stories. So basically, what this is telling you is the marketing now, it's more about doing data science and less about what the marketing managers will be thinking or designing. Even if it's a mix of both, it means that for leading corporations from other industries to continue reinforcing their intellectual monopolies, they need digital technologies. So the result can be summarized, for instance, with this case that corresponds to Siemens. And I'm just using the example of Siemens because I have a specific paper about this, where I'm simply depicting what I've been saying so far of these different layers of control. But what we also have at the global level, besides this structuring or stratification inside industry, are two intertwined processes. One is the process of intangibles extractivism, so science and technology that is produced broadly from the peripheries, now not only from the peripheries of the world, but also from part of the United States and so on and so forth, that then ends up being monetized by the intellectual monopolies. And also, we have what I would describe as epistemic totalitarianism, where, and it's not only about AI, but today I mostly discuss about AI, the science that we get is the one that intellectual monopolies want, where the research agendas are not only set by their interests, but also at the same time they silence other alternatives, and they silence also other ways of thinking and conceptualizing. There's a whole history, for instance, on biopiracy about this. And then just to conclude, I want to focus a bit on how all this impacts labor. And why this is relevant also from an intellectual monopoly framing. Because as some companies keep on concentrating more data, more knowledge, and rendering other organizations dependent, even other governments, at the same time, it seems to be that everyone can get access to all the knowledge in the world through a generative AI, and as a sort of like new development in the history also of search engines. But actually, what we are getting is a technology that is being used for outsourcing our capacities to think. So if we outsource in the AI part of our job as researchers, part of the job of journalists, of designers, and so on and so forth, so part of the creative tasks, and in the end, it's the generative AI, the one that is doing the ideation process, that creating the new. The first thing is that the new will be very much limited because the generative AI is trained with existing data. So a chance of having a sort of paradigm shift seems to be basically zero in this context. But more importantly, if we're outsourcing in a machine the process of thinking, the risk is losing our capacity to critically think and understand, and also therefore identify how to solve contemporary problems. And this is not just me saying it, it's also even Microsoft saying it. Because this is a Microsoft research paper where they clearly say that more confidence in generative AI is associated with less critical thinking. So generative AI is ultimately even shaping how we think, or if we think. And if we sum up everything that I've said, I think that we can inscribe this discussion about intellectual monopolies within this history of control technologies that have been used in the workplace, but also in the subordination of some countries over others. And in the specific case of intellectual monopolies, I think that what can be added to this picture is, first of all, that now control is exercised beyond ownership, also at the level of industries, and the result is that companies that seem to be independent actually are operating under a plan that is set by another company, the intellectual monopoly, and that this happens also with other types of organizations, universities, public research organizations, and it's increasingly happening more also with governments. There is a digital chapter also of these control technologies that I briefly referred to, which is this idea of customized control. So in the workplace, you probably heard the term algorithmic management and how it was used, for instance, or in particular for the gig economy. But now this is being used broadly also in brick and mortar retail and in many other industries. And it's a form of customized control of the worker, where the worker is profiled and not only its key performance indicators, but also even the type of training that the worker needs to do, how it will be working on a daily basis can be defined by algorithms that are trained with each and every worker's data. And summing up what I've said also about the way in which science and technology is being structured, we can speak of a process of corporate planning of science and technology that has these two different dimensions. One is that companies, intellectual monopolies, steer the direction of knowledge, and the other one is that they are also capturing disproportionately the results. But then there is another thing, and I say this, and I will just give a final slide more about sovereignty, which is the idea of twin extractivism. Because at the same time that we are witnessing an increasing extraction of data and knowledge co-produced globally, we are also seeing a further installation of data centers. And the installation of data centers represents an extraction, systematic extraction of electricity, of water, and also disrupts the local environments where they're installed. So in a way, intellectual monopolization, these forms of intangible extractivism end up reinforcing nature extractivism. And in this way, we can speak of a twin transition. I've done some research on this that also looks into how Amazon, Microsoft, and Google are developing software as a service and other technologies to present themselves to governments, to international multilateral organizations, and so on, as the ones that will solve the ecological crisis. Well, at the same time, they keep on fostering the adoption of their clouds. And of course, we know that it's not just about having the right technology what will solve the ecological crisis, but if we even assume that the right technology can solve the problem, if the right technology is developed under an intellectual monopoly regime, who will get access to that technology and adopt it and be able, therefore, to quote-unquote solve the crisis, which, again, clearly does not depend on identifying the right technology. So precisely moving into a more political discussion, what these companies end up wanting states to do, and with the help of the US government, just to go very briefly, are basically two things. And I will skip the part of regulation and just focus on the place they see for governments in terms of the promotion of the development of these technologies. And these are two things. One, as I was just saying, privileged regimes for the installation of data centers. And we are seeing this everywhere. So it's not only in the core of the world, also peripheral countries. I've been doing a lot of research, in particular in Latin America, in this regard, and progressive governments that understand the dangers of intellectual monopolization, big tech in particular, are still promoting special regimes for the installation of data centers with tax exemptions and so on and so forth. And the other one is the misleading term digital public infrastructure that is usually associated with the quote-unquote successful case of the India stack, where there you have Modi with Bill Gates celebrating the India stack. The India stack, and more broadly the idea of digital public infrastructure, is not infrastructure. In the end of the day, they are just services, digital services, provided by the public sector. Concretely, 3 services: a digital ID, a data exchange, and an e-payments solution. And of course, these 3 solutions need to be hosted somewhere. So there will be a need for data centers if governments develop a digital ID, an e-payment solution, and a data exchange. But there are 2 other reasons why big tech companies, and in particular Bill Gates, has been advocating for this quote-unquote digital public infrastructure for almost a decade now. The first one is the expansion of data subjects. If you think of the rest of the world, not the US, think of the poorest countries in the world. The penetration of the internet is still low. And this means that there are a lot of potential new data subjects, a lot of potential new consumers of their platforms and digital services that will not by themselves start consuming them if they haven't done it so far. It's way faster and more effective to have the government pushing everyone and obliging, ultimately making everyone inside the country use digital technologies. If the only way in which you can get access to a subsidy is by having a digital ID and using the payment solution, you will have to have a digital ID and use the payment solution. And this is basically what's been happening around the world. And the other reason is that it diverts the conversation. It gives the government a sense that they are doing something about digital sovereignty, that they're on top of their digital transformation, that they are really embracing all the promises of digital technologies, expanding productivity and generating what every government on earth wants, which is economic growth. Because in the end of the day, governments, even though they are supposed to be governing for the good of people, and these days one would expect also the planet, they want economic growth. So even progressive governments are focused on economic growth. And the promise of economic growth and more efficiencies associated with this digital public infrastructure is the third reason why they're all buying into the digital public infrastructure narrative. And while they do this, big tech companies continue expanding and reinforcing their power. Of course, there are other alternatives, and there are a few things that have been done by other governments, but by governments around the world, but still they all haven't been enough, because in every single case, there are just small solutions that do not see how interrelated everything is, as I was trying to show you today, and therefore how a solution or a way to build alternative or different technologies requires to have this ecosystemic view. And requires to think, I would say, about digital sovereignty in a democratic and international way. So for me, digital sovereignty is not about where the technology is installed. Actually, the installation of data centers not only reinforces nature extractivism, but also doesn't imply that that particular administration or government will have more influence or will be able to govern those data centers. There is something that is called the Cloud Act. It means that if Trump basically wants Microsoft to provide access to data that is stored, let's say, in France, Microsoft will have to do it if it's within that legislation. So, and at the same time, when a company installs a data center in another country, it in the end operates as a military basis. It's not that that government will be able to get, I don't know, access to the data or will be able to use the data center in a particular way. It's still a completely foreign technology that doesn't generate jobs. The number of jobs once the data center is installed drops to up to 50 employees per building. And of course, these are technical jobs. So it's not that the frontier AI R&D is done inside the data center physically. And at the same time, they don't generate any other like economic structural transformations. Actually, the opposite. They completely disrupt the environments. So it's not about the territoriality. A company, again, actually, these companies, when they are based and do part of their R&D in a country, it means that they will be capturing more of the research that is done by other organizations in that country. It's not about the nationality. Companies like Siemens, SAP, Mistral, all the European, more or less leaders, they are all completely inside this broader predatory ecosystem in semi-core, semi-periphery, or directly peripheral positions. And there is nothing that would tell us that they would not operate exactly in the same way as an Amazon, Microsoft, or Google if they could get rid of their dependence on these companies. On the contrary, I would argue that digital sovereignty opens up an opportunity for us to discuss about governance, to discuss about how we govern technology, how we produce technology, what technology we have, for what, and not only for whom, but also by whom. So I think that there is an opportunity to discuss around the world about sovereignty, but not, again, as a way to expand techno-nationalisms and ways of balkanizing against each other, but on the contrary, as a way to find an alternative that has the public funding, the necessary public funding to work, and that ultimately can be inscribed within a broader project. Because again, I think that digital sovereignty, for me, to some extent, has become an excuse to discuss broadly about how much states not only need to be made accountable, but needs to be rebuilt, transformed, in order to transform democracies and expand democracies. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia. Oh yeah, if you want to run this, I can. Okay. I've run the mic a lot. Questions? Thank you so much for
Hello, there we go. Thank you so much. This is incredible work that you're doing. I'm Claudia Natalia Fombacano, Boliviana. It's nice to see a Latin American scholar. So I have a really weird and specific question. How do you envision this playing out in places like Kazakhstan, developing nations that are, have highly centralized, smaller governments, a high level of literacy? So it's just a very different kind of case, and so I'm curious what you think about that.
This reminds me that I at one point I thought when Desiree was introducing me, I should say more about, and then I didn't say that actually big tech companies and their CEOs, Bill Gates in particular, but also Eric Schmidt and many others, have been sitting in the advisory boards of different. No, I think I'm wired already. Maybe it's too low. Yeah, it's too low. I realize now. But I can put it here. There. Have been advising the US government. And one of the things that they've been saying is, you need us, big tech, because there are governments in the world, countries in the world, economies that actually without us, will go through a complete authoritarian path where there will be a process where social media and so on and the free speech that we are providing will be completely hampered by their governments. And they put the example of Kazakhstan. In fact, this is why I remember there is also, and the example I think it is actually in Eric Schmidt's book about the futures that he sees in relation to digital technologies. So I think that usually when one starts thinking about true democratization and how to empower communities, of course, we reach a barrier, which is the huge asymmetries and these different absorptive capacities. And that in principle, it will sound perfect to say, okay, now everyone will have an opportunity to come and say what they think and decide collectively the technological priorities. But to do that, you need to understand what the discussion is about. So definitely when I think about these alternatives, I connect them to education. And in fact, a specific case that I'm working on at the moment, more on a policy level, to implement this idea of a completely detached ecosystem from big tech is education, is public education and how to decouple and this is mostly policy work in Europe, but how the European Union could fund the design of a completely independent ecosystem that provides the necessary technologies to, let's say, elementary schools, and that can be first implemented in one city, and that needs to be discussed with the teachers, that need to be discussed collectively with specialists in pedagogical issues and so on. So not only with the computer scientists or the social scientists and experts, And I think that starting by education has several purposes, but one is in the long run to contribute to create these absorptive capacities and level the playing field, because there is nothing that can be done just by instructing and giving them a briefing. Okay, read about this is how AI works, and now come and let's all collectively decide what digital technologies we want. Again, in principle may sound super democratic, but then concretely it will be anything but that. But then also it's a way to prevent creating more and more citizens that are incapable of thinking, of creative thinking, because they are outsourcing or their creative processes to the AI. So I think that the problem will not only be in specific countries in the world, but ultimately this same problem will be a problem that will be felt more broadly globally as we continue adopting uncritically generative AI and using it for replacing part of our process of learning ultimately. And this is what Google is actually proposing. And this is also why education is so important, because Google is offering for free its solutions to students, to university students actually, for 1 year. And the way in which, and if you haven't used it, those that are students, I hope that you don't subscribe to this after this conversation, but you can still do it. And the way Google sells it, it's free the first year, but the way in which it advertises is precisely by saying that the Gen AI can help you start thinking about your essays, your problems. So it's start thinking. It's not, you can check if your English was right, or you can check if you had spelling mistakes, or no, it's you can outsource in the AI the actual doing and thinking of the tasks. So I think that your question is super pertinent, not only for Kazakhstan, I would say.
I have a question. Yeah, thanks so much. This was such a sweeping view of like so many aspects of like digitization. I guess I was thinking a lot about like this idea of the corporate planning of science and technology innovation, and what really came to mind for me was Bell Labs, like from like last century. And you know, Bell Labs was like a source of so much innovation that we build on today. And I think a lot of scientists actually viewed it as a casualty when it got broken up. So a major vector, I guess, in this was antitrust regulation, and we're starting to see the role of like antitrust in targeting like the big tech companies. But it seems like right now they're basically targeting like the search infrastructure, which given like everything that you've laid out feels a little bit unsatisfactory maybe, because there's so many other aspects of like ownership. So I guess I'm just wondering if you could talk about like what the implications might be for antitrust regulation, and maybe also talking about in other contexts where like the state actually has more of a direct role in the market, like in China, for example, where yeah, maybe antitrust would look a little bit different. So yeah, thank you.
So about antitrust, the problem is that antitrust still operates with the same toolbox of the Bell Labs, which basically is that the leading corporation becomes bigger and bigger and becomes the only actor in the market, and markets are more detached from each other. But in what I've been showing and the way in which I think global capitalism operates, everything is completely interconnected, and antitrust authorities are not prepared to identify network power. So what for instance, Farrell and Newman would describe as weaponized interdependence as the US government or the Chinese government using the positioning of its companies in a geopolitical way, I would add to that picture that it's actually the companies themselves that are weaponizing the interdependence, that they position themselves in the strategic bottlenecks and choke points, and in some cases like Amazon, Microsoft, and Google end up having a panopticon view even of a huge part of the global economy, and they can directly, even with the threat of weaponizing interdependence, directly make all the other actors in the system comply. So they will never become a single player in one market. It's only in some, in some cases, few cases, exceptions, like the Google search, where you see this dynamic, whereas what we actually see is more and more companies entering their ecosystem and given the sense that is very democratic, that is very competitive, because there are so many companies, AI, no worries, there are so many companies developing the models. Well, yes, but you're looking at the wrong part of the network to identify where the power is. And then when China, I would say that it will not be fair to neither to my research nor to the research of the other people about that work in China to say just one, two things about it, but allow me to just point towards a few things. I would say First of all, that the emergence of Chinese intellectual monopolies in the tech sector cannot be explained without the Chinese government. At the same time, there is, I think, that this interplay that now becomes so clear in the US between US big tech and the US government, that before was more hidden, was not so straightforward, in China has always been out there and easy to see. And the interplay doesn't mean that they are, and I speak of this relationship now as a ruling coalition, but the coalition doesn't mean that they always agree with each other and that they're just simply happy with sharing this ruling position. The other way around. There are constant clashes, internal clashes of power, and sometimes we see that in the news, probably many other times we miss them, and the same for China. So I would argue for those countries that try to say, or governments that try to say, okay, let's learn the good from China and let's leave the anti-democratic facts on the side, that even trying to do that will not work, because China was able to develop its own big tech companies before the development of all this US big tech as they are right now. The companies were not completely inside China when the Great Firewall was installed. So for a country like, I don't know, France, Germany, it would be impossible to say, okay, tomorrow we are going to create the German firewall. And it will definitely result in a massive contestation from the citizens. And this is another thing that we need to take into account, which is that part of those that back up these companies, that really support them, are the citizens themselves, because they do know that these companies get their data, but at the same time they get things that are cool and pleasant. So this is also why the strategy of thinking of digital sovereignty, for me, it not only needs to start from the public sector, because because we cannot even start a discussion about sovereignty if the public sector itself is dependent on these technologies, but also because we need to secure demand. And just creating new solutions out there that then nobody will demand because they are not as good in terms of user experience, and they don't have the other already existing solutions have the network effects and so on and so forth, will simply not work. Whereas the state can secure demand. So I would say that following the example of China, it's certainly at dead end for the rest of the world. Also, China had a lot of resources. This is not the case in most of the countries in the world. At least most of the countries in the world don't want to dedicate all those resources to creating an alternative. And finally, about the Chinese case, I would argue that the outcome is certainly not the outcome that I would advocate for. Having, again, is what I was saying before in terms of, let's say tomorrow Germany has SAP and Siemens debunking Amazon, Microsoft, and Google from their role in providing cloud and so on. Would things be different? No, not really. There will still be intellectual monopolies regardless of the nationality. There will still be processes where knowledge is co-produced by many, is funded by the public sector with taxpayers' money, and then in the end of the day, the profits are harvested by a few companies that also direct the type of knowledge that we get, and therefore that knowledge may not necessarily be the one that could better contribute to solving major ecological, social, and eco-political problems, I would say.
So you talked about how these core companies are able to steer conceptual directions for this big attached group. And that addresses the conscious thinking. I was wondering if these guys are pursuing unconscious thinking and trying to steer things like habit and morality and churches, replacing that with these alternatives that actually get control of that part of our brains.
As far as I know, the answer is yes, but now I'm doing a more structured research on that. What is it that I know? So I've been looking at specific cases. For instance, how people that were perceived as very critical within the social sciences and humanities ended up working for Microsoft Research, and what type of publications they are doing, and how their research is influencing not only the actual research on computer science, but how we think about computer science, about their role and so on. I've also been looking particularly at the work of some economists like Hal Varian, who is a microeconomist that is a chief economist at Google, and also is actually the microeconomist that has written the textbook that most economists in the world study with. And this guy, for instance, has a paper about all the great things of digital platforms and how competitive and how much they contribute to economic growth. And there is also another paper, I think that it also comes from Google. I'm quite sure that it comes from Google, that basically, for instance, says that there is a sort of like, it is intrinsic to humans to become addicted to things, and therefore we shouldn't blame social media, because it was our fault that humans are addicted to things. So I've identified some of these papers that for me were quite eye-opening of the extent to which they control the research agenda, way beyond things that would be the more obvious ones, like what type of AI models we are getting. And now I'm, as part of a project that I'm starting on November 1st, actually, so literally now, there will be someone working with me as a postdoc that will be precisely looking at these forms of capture as well. But on a more like scale-based and building networks and so on.
We have time for about one more question.
Okay, thank you for your insightful presentation. I have some question about the AI bubble that is in China. Many of our companies is, some of the I think there are so many source waste because there are so many companies doing the same things because of the governments that ask them to do that. And in that case, I think those big tech sometimes is not focusing just to produce some goods for the public, but just for pursuing some just a fantastic tech. But in that case, I think a lot of the source is waste, and they did not make some real things, I think. So what's your idea about that?
Okay, when you started talking about bubble, I saw that you were like, everybody these days is talking about the AI, potential AI financial bubble. I can also comment on that, but I will reply to your question for the sake of time and try to be very brief. I think this is the first time that I'm going to say this out loud, although I've written this idea 2 years ago when I started writing my new book. I think that one of the strategies that these companies use to reinforce their intellectual monopoly is to produce what in the book I defined as bullshit innovation. So using the term of bullshit jobs from Grever, well, bullshit innovation is basically things that are never aimed at being sold in a market. It's just a way to present themselves as the frontier, as look at all the things that we can do, and think also of this like the trip to the moon, like if they are capable of doing that, how come they cannot produce like cars that are like the ultimate best? So it's part of ultimately of a marketing strategy. They present that as an innovation, but the aim is really not to sell it. And in some cases, if in the end consumers want to buy it, then perfect. But if they don't, it doesn't matter. It was not the real purpose. And this goes back to what for me is an extremely relevant question, which is what's an innovation? I teach economics of innovation, and my students would typically be, but like, no, but can you really say that Facebook was an innovation? And it's like, what's the concept of innovation that you have? If it's like a technological change, well, but, and if you think of it as if it could be thought detached from the political dimension, yeah, maybe no. But consumers are completely accepting it. They're embracing it. So clearly it is an innovation as a social relation where you're identifying something that it's different, new, and people are validating it. So it's this social relation, the validation of what you are producing. And instead of thinking of the specific products as independent from each other, what they are reinforcing for me is a whole intellectual monopoly. And this is why part of the reinforcement of the intellectual monopoly entails also not only the bullshit innovations, but also the failures. They also make a case of their failures. They present their failures as a proof of how innovative they are. at the same time. So it's all part, and I don't see these companies as, here they innovate, and here is narrative, and here is data extraction. I see all the things interconnected, actually.
Great. So Cecilia, thank you so much for an incredible talk. It was definitely sweeping, as Jenna said. And thanks for great questions from the audience. So cheers.
Thank you.